As I mentioned, it is Martin Luther King Day today. And thanks to new books, this is Carlos Guillermo Smith over on Twitter. Thanks to new books pushed by Ron DeSantis and the GOP Florida legislature, books about Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are being banned in Florida school districts. Among the rejected titles are a book about Martin Luther King Jr. intended for fourth graders, a biography of Rosa Parks for second grade classrooms, a first grade Berenstain Bears book about God, and multiple titles including gay, lesbian, and trans characters and families. Yeah, welcome to the brave new world of Republican politics. On Martin Luther King Day, they are aggressively banning books about Martin Luther King down in Florida and in multiple other states as well. Tom Cotton recently talking, he was, this is, actually I'm going to get into this in I think in some more detail in the third hour, but I'll just give you a preview. Republicans are using King's words to justify their own racism, essentially. Tom Cotton was grilling military officers before the Senate, and he said, why can't we replay Martin Luther King Jr.'s content of a character and not the color of his skin speech? He said that in the context of diversity training in the military. He doesn't want there to be any. So instead of diversity training, says Senator Tom Cotton, he's from Alabama, isn't he? Where they're celebrating Robert E. Lee Day, I think. Let me just double check. I tossed that. Yeah, Alabama. No, he's from Arkansas. Yeah, okay, I got the wrong state. Anyway, Dan Rather posted an absolutely fascinating piece. Dan Rather started covering the White House in 1962. Actually started covering Martin Luther King in 1962. Became the official White House correspondent for CBS News in 1964. And in '64, he was one of the moderators of Face the Nation, Dan Rather was. And they had Dr. Martin Luther King on as a guest. And Rather asked him, and I find this absolutely fascinating. Dan Rather said, do you think there's a real danger of the Republican Party? Now keep in mind, '64, this was 4 years before Richard Nixon declared the Southern Strategy. And yet, this was the year that they passed the Civil Rights Act, and you know, there was significant Democratic opposition from the South, but there was also substantial Republican opposition. So anyhow, Dan Rather asked Martin Luther King, do you think there's a real danger of the Republican Party becoming the white man's party in this country? And King answers, and I quote, I think there is a real danger. I've talked with some Negro Republicans who are very concerned about this. I see trends and developments which will reveal that unless the liberals of the Republican Party take a much more decisive role in leadership positions, this will become a white man's party. And I think this will be tragic for that Republican Party, as well as tragic for the nation. Dan Rather goes on to note that in '68, you know, you've got the Southern Strategy, Reagan demonizing welfare queens, George H.W. Bush's Willie Horton ads, et cetera. And back in August of last year, Dan Rather had tweeted, make no mistake, if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, he would be stigmatized as woke and attacked accordingly. Today, Rather is writing, everything Dr. King stood for is under attack in America today. You can see it in the efforts to disenfranchise voters. You can find it in the whitewashing of history and the demonization of so-called critical race theory. Whether it's the banning of books, attacks on labor rights, or the death knell of affirmative action, an America of ideas, engagement, and reckoning with our past is under siege. In the sneers at wokeness, Dan Rather writes, one finds an effort by the privileged to hold on to the positions of power they feel they are owed, and I would add, by virtue of the color of their skin. It is an insult, Rather writes, to everything Dr. King hoped to achieve. So here we are. What does this mean to you? What does Martin Luther King mean, his legacy, this holiday, what does this mean to you? And how does America go forward, reconciling with our racial past, and particularly in the face of Republican efforts to block even the discussion of America's racial past in our public schools? I think these are really huge and substantial issues. I think this issue has not only not gone away, but the Republicans planning, you know, as they're preparing for the 2024 presidential election, are putting it front and center. The whole wokeness thing is really an attack on discussions about American history.